Okay, so we're talking about different conceptions of God today, and we'll talk very briefly about Paul Tillich, who, as I said, is a religious existentialist, a Christian existentialist, who's going to sort of unpack sort of unpack the old conception of God and say that we need to reformulate a new conception of God, and he's going to give us some existential reasons as to why. But so here I have this sort of flow chart. And the reason why I put this up is because you see that the question of God is a very interesting question to ask. You know, whether or not you believe in God, why or why not you believe in God, and then furthermore, what attributes and characteristics, how would you describe God, is a very interesting way to approach somebody's worldview. It's not necessarily the only starting point. There may be, let's say, for the interview assignment that I'm referring to, there may be several ways that you can approach somebody's worldview, but the metaphysical question of divinity or the existence of God is a potentially very meaningful one. Is you can kind of go into somebody's worldview and start to sort of unpack their worldview from that starting point. Do you believe in God? Why or why not? And then, if you do believe in God, how are we to understand God? Okay, and you see that there are many different conceptions of God. You can go from polytheism all the way to atheism and nihilism. Now, some of you are familiar with some of these terms, okay? The idea, you guys are probably familiar with monotheism and polytheism. I'm going to be introducing a bit of terminology here. And again, I have to apologize right off the bat because a lot of this terminology, like pantheism and panentheism, they're very similar sounding. So we need to make that distinction. But this terminology is going to help us understand some of the philosophies that we're going to be covering in the next few classes. So I put this flowchart here basically just to say that, first of all, there are many different conceptions of God, even let's say in monotheism, even in, let's say, just in Christianity. You have several different denominations and sects of Christianity alone that may have different understandings and interpretations of what is meant by the idea, the concept God. And furthermore, just to kind of give you a sense here, is when I've asked my students what their conception of God is in the past, you get a kind of a wide range that typically, based on our demographic here, most of the students, like I would say about half the students believe in God or are religious, and another half don't believe in God. The group that doesn't believe in God, the half that doesn't believe in God, many of them will be sort of agnostic. That is to say, they don't know or they don't care or they are sort of indifferent. That basically the question of God is sort of meaningless in a kind of a pragmatic sense. And there are some students that are sort of self-declared atheists, that they say, no, I don't believe in God, and there are good reasons for why I don't believe in God or why God does not exist. You know, from in the group, the half of the class that does claim to be religious and does claim to have some conception of God, for the most part, just because of culturally, our cultural origins, most people here are probably monotheistic in a Christian sense. And then there are several Muslim students who are also monotheistic, and Jewish students. And there are also, students that are from Eastern religions, such as, Buddhist students and potentially Hindu students that have potentially a polytheistic conception of God. So these are all words that we sort of need to unpack. Okay, let's get to the next point here. Now, my next point is we need to be careful when we talk about God. And I'll come back to this in just a second. But what do I mean by this? Is that there are many different names for God. Okay, you talk about God as Buddha or Jesus or Vishnu or Krishna or Allah or Yahweh, and we sort of get caught up in our conceptualization and our formalization of what we mean by God or divine. And I've often heard religious people have on occasion told me, no, we have the true God and everybody else is lost and confused, okay? And we're only going to be happy when they accept our God. But then when you interview the other groups, they say exactly the same thing about the first group, okay? So the question is sort of who's right and who's wrong. And the problem is that it gives rise to some tensions, is our formulation, our words our labels, we get sort of, we identify with them and we get sort of excited about them. So this is kind of a joke here, but there's a deeper point, okay? Like these two waging armies, there will be no peace until they renounce their rabbit god and accept our duck god. And the point is, it's kind of a joke because they're ultimately referring to one and the same thing. They're just looking at it from two different vantage points. If you look at this as being ears, then it looks like a rabbit. If you look at it like being a bill, then it looks like a duck. So we're trying ultimately, this is kind of one of my points, is we are all trying to give an account of this world, this existence, this creation, this underlying mystery of existence, and we're all trying to account for it and articulate it from our very limited human vantage point. We are limited intellectually, we are limited perceptually, and so if we go back to Nietzsche, the idea that do not get excited about your concepts, do not confuse your concepts for real things. Just because you have a word for God in your culture, doesn't mean that you understand what God is. So that's a very important point. So basically, the point is we're all feeling out the world from our own limited vantage points. We can only ever account for the world, which is the world as we have encountered it individually and within our own culture. So the person, suppose the world is this elephant, the person standing at the front is going to say, this world is made out of spears. This world is made out of bones. And they may then have some ideas or implications about what the world is. Oh, you need to be cautious or something like that. And the person who's in the rear, who is feeling the tail, says, no, this world is not made out of bones. This world is made out of ropes. And they might consequently have a different conception of reality or God or divinity consequently. So we're all trying to make sense of the world from our own limited vantage point. So what I'm trying to say is, in a sense, there is no right or wrong conception of God, so long as we said earlier in the semester, so long as it is consistent onto itself. Everybody is basically accounting for one aspect of this broader reality that is forever elusive to us, in a sense. So there's a famous physicist that said something like that. He said something like, I forget who it was. I think it was Max Planck or something like that. He said, it's not that this world is stranger than you think. It's stranger than you can think. You understand? So it's not that this world is weirder than you know. It's weirder than you can ever possibly know. It eludes even the possibility of truly knowing it and understanding it. Okay, so keep that in mind. Let me just give you one point here. This is not a point that I made in the other class, but this idea that, again, our worldview is also shaped by our environment. So if you look at, let's say, many polytheistic rules, this is a point that a friend of mine made, and I haven't verified this, but there's maybe some anthropological kind of truth to this. That if you look at monotheism you typically is sort of correlated with cultures that come out of the desert, because there is, day and night, there is light and darkness, there's the sky and there is the ground, so there's the earth and then there's the heavens, and there's the kind of a clear distinction. And then you have, there's God and then there's creation, there's God and there's the devil. There are clear lines in the experience of that environment. Whereas if you take a culture that comes out of, let's say, a very lush environment in terms of flora and fauna and diversity and multiplicity of animals and species and so on, you have a typical relation with polytheistic religions. There are many gods, there are many entities. Okay, so there might be an element of truth to that. Now, two more points of caution. It's actually the same point of caution articulated from two perspectives. One point of basically, the point of caution is, when we talk about God, we always have to realize that we are using words to try to articulate something that is in truth ineffable. What I mean by that is, you're trying to speak about something which truly cannot be spoken of. Because for instance, how do you speak of that which is eternal and all powerful? Okay, as soon as you put words to it, in some sense, you limit it, you turn it into something that it isn't. All right. So one group of people that makes that kind of claim are some theologists, specifically like Martin Buber, who we will talk about in a few weeks, and Paul Tillich, that we're going to talk about at the end of today's lecture. Basically, give us that caution us, and say, when you talk about God, don't get lost in your words, and don't get the false the false idea that you've understood actually what you're talking about. So that's one point. And we need to proceed very carefully, because this is precisely what we're going to be doing for the next half hour or so, is we're going to be articulating different conceptions of God in abstract linguistic terms. So we have to always be mindful of the limitations of the words, that we're sort of trying to point it out without this kind of false reassurance that we actually fully grasp what we're trying to articulate. Another point of another philosophy, which basically says the same thing, but for a different reason, are philosophies like logical positivism, like Wittgenstein, who would say something like, when you talk about any metaphysical idea, such as God, truly you don't even know what you're talking about. So it's better if you just be quiet, it's better to not even talk about God, because if you truly examine your conversation around metaphysical concepts like God, you will discover that you don't even know what you're saying. Okay. Now, let me try to articulate that. Is, if I speak of God and you speak of God, how do you know that we are even talking about the same thing? I personally believe that it can be done. That I think that you can speak of metaphysical ideas in a meaningful and coherent way. But that's an interesting point, nonetheless, that we have to be mindful of. That do not have the illusion that because you've put words to something, that it actually refers to anything meaningful. Okay, so the logical positivist would say this is what we call nonsense. It's not nonsense in that it's kind of stupid or absurd. It's nonsense in that these words, let's say God, don't point to anything. They don't point to anything in any real world. Okay, so just be mindful of that. So with that said, let's jump into it. Okay, let's try to kind of come up with these abstractions and this academic terminology around different conceptions of God, and hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll have come across some conceptions of God that are quite different than what you thought, and maybe you'll be exposed to, you'll be impressed by how many different perspectives there actually are. So, how do we typically understand God? God is understood as, if you want to put it, in the language of the Enlightenment, this kind of intelligent designer. That God is this cosmic animating force or power that is typically understood as having some benevolence, some intelligence, and a will. Okay, this sort of creative will, this intelligence, which also creates or modifies the world. Okay, if you come from a typically monotheistic tradition, what was I going to say? This God, this idea of God or divinity may be personified or anthropomorphized. What I mean by that is we understand God as being, in some sense, similar to us. God has a kind of, God speaks the same language as us. God has a psyche. God may even be depicted, as we get in Christianity, may be depicted as, God our Father in a very sort of anthropomorphic human form. Even in the book of Genesis, it says God made us in his image. So we sort of reverse engineer that to understand God as a kind of this humanoid figure, this fatherly figure sitting on the clouds in heaven with a nice thick white beard, looking down on us, monitoring the situation. And there you would have a kind of what we're going to call an all-powerful transcendent God. God is this force or this power, which is outside of this world. Okay, it's heavenly, it's otherworldly. Or you can have a conception of God, which we're going to talk about in a second, as immanent, where God is a kind of a cosmic animating force. It's a kind of a creative principle or energy, which everything grows out of or comes out of. Okay, and in that conception, God is present in all things. Okay, divinity or this divine creative energy is present in all things. So I'll tell you, I'll try to simplify your life. I'll tell you which words I want you to retain and which words I'm just giving you out of sort of curiosity. These two words I want you to retain. They're quite important. So we have immanence and transcendence. Let's start with transcendence. Transcendence is basically an idea of God as being beyond or outside the physical. Okay, God is a metaphysical entity. God is beyond space and time. God is beyond the laws of physics. God is not in this world. God is outside of this world. God is otherworldly. Okay, so you cannot go in search of God in this world. You're not going to find God in this world. This world is somehow kind of secondary. It's material. It's mundane. It's the profane world. Okay, and the world of the divine or the spiritual is something else. Okay, it's sort of like another dimension, so to speak. That is what we mean by a transcendent God. God is not finite, is not limited, cannot be encapsulated. God is otherworldly. And what you mean by immanence, and we're going to contrast these two, but they're not necessarily contradictory, because we can have a conception of God which combines both of these elements. And what we mean by immanence is an idea of divine presence in which the divine is encompasses or is manifested in the material world. So that is to say, this is what you would get. Transcendence is typically what you get, but not necessarily. Typically what you get in monotheistic religions of Abrahamic religions, such as Christianity, Islam, Judaism. A sense of divinity as being immanent is what you get in many philosophies, specifically Eastern philosophies, and also sort of Aboriginal religions. That God is this generative force which underlies everything and which is in everything. So everything is and partakes in that divinity, okay, including ourselves. So we're going to need to unpack that. And these are the other set of terminology that I want you to retain, okay? Theism, typically in this sense understood as monotheism. Theism, pantheism, panentheism. In the first one, you have a God that is entirely transcendent. I'll go through these in a bit more detail, but let me just label them very quickly. In monotheism, as I said, typically you have a God that is entirely transcendent. In pantheism, you have a God that is entirely immanent. And in panentheism, you have both. The world is the manifestation of God, and yet there's something about God which is elusive and permanently transcendent. Okay, but before I unpack these further, let's look at the root word here. Okay, theism, theisem, theism. This is the word that we're going to modify in about 3 ways. Okay, so just keep this in mind. The first way that we modify this word is with a prefix that denotes the quantity of God or gods. So you can say, for instance, atheism, which is a word we're familiar with. Atheism is the belief in no gods. So a prefix which signifies, nil. There is no God. God does not exist. Another one that we're familiar with mostly is the idea of monotheism, which is the belief in one God or in the oneness of God. And another one that we're familiar with, another prefix that modifies this, is polytheism, which is the belief in many gods or deities or demigods. Okay, that's one way that we can modify it. And there's actually another one, which I might get into, I might not get into it, is what we call henotheism. Henotheism is a kind of a polytheism that ultimately is really a monotheism. I might unpack that in a little while. Okay, that's one way in which we modify the word theism, by modifying the prefix which signifies the quantity. How we understand God as singular or plural. Okay, a sort of a monism or a dualism or a pluralism. All right. Another way that we modify it, let me just jump ahead just to show you, is what we call deism. So again, I have to apologize because, as I said, some of these words are very similar in nature. So instead of THE, we have DE. Okay, so here what we're going to get is sort of a God that is hands off. God is as a spectator of the world, but not an intervening force in the world. So that's another one. That would sort of denote God's involvement, active involvement in the world, as a kind of a yes, he is involved, or no, he isn't. So theism versus deism. And the last modification is, again, another modification of the prefix, which is what we get here. Okay, pantheism and panentheism. And this refers to what we were talking about here, is how we interplay with immanence and transcendence. In theism, as is typically the case with monotheism, we get a God that is entirely transcendent. Okay, so let's just look at this. For instance, you have, again, you see that you see the limits of the language here and of the visual representation of how we're depicting God. Okay, God is this nice blue circle. Okay, God is outside of the universe. God and existence and his creation are two separate things. They are not to be equated. God is above and greater than his creation. And what you also notice is that there seems to be a one-way arrow. Okay, that's what we call the idea of the impassibility of God. God can influence the world, but the creation does not tell God what to do. Okay, that is to say, creation is dependent on God, but God is not dependent on creation. It's a one-way street. All right. So God is, again, here you see, purely outside of physical existence and physical reality. In pantheism, what you get is a God that existence is God. God and the universe are one and the same. That the universe is this sort of the divine generative energy, and everything that we call, real, and everything that we interact with is an expression or grows out of God, so to speak. So everything is God. Okay, so this is you might see God in the eyes of your lover. You might see God in nature. You might see God in a flower, or you might see God in your Sharpie pen if you look hard enough. So yeah, but I don't see it. Okay, so maybe you don't see it because you're not looking at it properly or something like that. But and I'll come back to that. Let me see if there's anything else I want to say about that right now. No, I'll come back to this. And panentheism is what we get in many Eastern philosophies and religions. Panentheism we also get in many Eastern philosophies and religions, and we also get panentheism in mystical traditions of monotheism. So let's say mystical saints of Christianity express a conception of God like this, like Saint Teresa of Avalon, Saint John of the Cross, many other saints. You get this in Sufism, which is mystical Islam. The branch of mystical Islam, Sufism, has a conception of God like this. You get it in Kabbalism and mystical Judaism. And when we talk about Martin Buber in 2 or 3 weeks, this is the sort of conception of God that he's going to have. We are all God, okay? And there are ways of living in this world in which you can see God in everything. You see the total being and beauty of God in anything. So he's going to be advocating something like this. Let me see if there's another point that I want to make here. So you see that these two kind of things are incompatible. If you say, for instance, in one culture, if you say, I am God and we are all expressions of God, and this world is God, from the perspective of a hardcore monotheist that has a transcendental idea of God, that is blasphemous. Okay, no, creation is not God, and to equate God with his creation is a mistake. Now, let me make this point. Okay, this is a little bit funny, this point. So, but in this culture, in a monotheistic culture, let's say in Christianity, if you have a mystical or religious experience and you suddenly realize that you are one with existence, and you therefore interpret that as you are Jesus Christ, or you are God incarnate, your friends are going to laugh at you. Okay, and you might go to the insane asylum. Whereas in a pantheistic or in a panentheistic culture or conception, if you say I finally realized that I'm, one with God and one with the universe. Your friends are going to say, congratulations, you finally found out. That's what Alan Watts says. So let me make this point. Okay, this is okay. Let me put it this way. There's a syndrome. This is real. Okay, I'm not making this up. There's a syndrome which is called Jerusalem syndrome. Jerusalem syndrome is basically like God or a sort of Messiah psychosis. So you momentarily believe that you are Jesus Christ. Now, this I imagine can happen anywhere, okay? But it seems to happen statistically with greater prevalence in Jerusalem, okay? Now, why is this? It's a psychological phenomenon. You have somebody who works really hard and saves up some money to go to Jerusalem because they're very, very religious and they want to visit the Holy Land. And when they get there, they're jet lagged. So already they're a little bit fuzzy in their head. And they're sort of disenchanted by the fact that what they're expecting to find is, an old city that resembles the stories of the Old Testament. And what they actually find is a modern city with cars and Starbucks and McDonald's. And so they're disenchanted by it, and they're confused, and they're jet lagged. So on occasion, you have an individual with these circumstances that goes back to his hotel room, rips the white bed sheets off of his hotel mattress, wraps himself up in his white bed sheets, and goes out onto the streets to proclaim that he is Jesus Christ and that you need to repent for your sins and that you need to seek salvation. Okay. And now this is the problem. The problem is you might be walking. I've never been to Jerusalem. Okay, but you might be walking down the road and there is a guy who is claiming that he's Jesus Christ, saying that you need to repent for your sins to seek the kingdom of God. And then you walk another 200 meters, and then there's another guy also dressed in white, also saying that he's Jesus Christ. Okay, now that is inconsistent with the fundamental framework of this belief system, because there's only one God, and now there's two of you that are claiming that are God. So which one is it? Was it the first one or was it the second one? You might be tempted to say, well, neither are God. They're both sort of a little bit confused. Okay, they need an ice pack on their head, and they need to go home and sleep so that the psychosis can pass. All right. So that's the point, is if in this culture you have a religious experience and you say, I am God, you're likely to go to the insane asylum. Whereas in this culture, let's say in Hindu culture, if you say, I just had an epiphany and I realized that my ego is an illusion, and then I am basically Brahman, which is the consciousness of the universe, projecting itself out through this form that is me, and that basically I am consequently God, and so are you, and so is he, and so is she. Your friends are going to say, good, congratulations, you finally find out. Here you might go to the insane asylum, and here you might be labeled as an avatar or as a guru. Okay, you may be able to start your own cult. So just keep that in mind. Okay, in some cases these things are incompatible. So let's define these terms a little bit further. What do you mean by monotheism? Monotheism is the belief in one God. Again, as I said, in many cases sort of anthropomorphized, in some cases anthropomorphized, in one God or in the oneness of God, and typically understood as a transcendental God in the first sense here. Let me throw out the other one, which was polytheism and henotheism. This one I don't want you to retain. But in polytheism, if I ask you to think of a polytheistic religion, many people will think of Hinduism, which is not quite right. And let me explain why that is the case. A polytheism would be something like Norse mythology or Greek mythology or Roman mythology, with the sort of the pantheon of the gods. Okay, you have Zeus and Jupiter and Odin and all the other gods. There might be a hierarchy to the gods. There might be a community of gods, but the gods are all sort of understood as being independent of one another. Whereas in Hinduism, you do have all the gods. You have, Krishna and Lakshmi and Ganesha and Hanuman and Ram, and it goes on and on. Okay, but all of these gods in Hinduism, in let's say Greek mythology, these gods exist as separate from one another. Whereas in Hinduism, in many important schools of Hinduism, all of these gods, the polytheistic gods, are really expressions of. They are the immanent expression of one transcendental God, which is called Brahman or Vishnu, which is the cosmic consciousness of the entire universe. which projects itself and manifests itself in different forms, including us. Okay, we are it as well. So all of these gods are basically the masks or the avatars that Brahman uses when he goes into the world. He goes into the manifest immanent world to interact with other beings. Okay, so you have Brahman is the monotheistic transcendent God who manifests himself in the form of different immanent gods that actually people see and claim to have interacted with, and so on. All right. So that is what we call that version is what we call a henotheistic religion. It is basically a polytheism, but it's really a kind of a polyism that's a disguise for what is truly a metaphysical monotheistic religion. So that basically Brahman is the kind of the puppet master, and all of these other gods are the puppets of this sort of puppet master, the masks that it wears when it comes on the stage. Okay, let's proceed here. Let me skip over this. Different attributes that are typically given to the monotheistic God. So let's consider this one. This is also very interesting. Deism as a sort of a modification of theism. Okay, theism. Now we have deism. What is deism? It's interesting. Okay, maybe some of you guys have this conception of God. This is a conception of God that came out of the Enlightenment in Europe, which was at the time a culture that was steeped in Christianity, and you had the intellectuals in this culture who were, many of them were mathematicians and scientists and astronomers, physicists, who wanted to get rid of the idea of the possibility of anything being supernatural or miraculous, or the possibility of divine intervention. But they weren't ready to give up the idea of God altogether. Okay, many physicists today are atheists. Maybe some, I presume many physicists are also theists. But back in the day, the early physicists in modern science were not ready. They weren't ready to hold on. They weren't ready to abandon the idea of God. So what they said was something like this. They said, God was there at the beginning. God is sort of like the Big Bang. God was the first cause. God set the universe in motion, but then the universe operates on its own. Okay, it's sort of a kind of a harmonious machine that does not need, occasional intervention. So they kept the idea of God as a kind of a metaphysical idea to account for the beginning of existence. But when existence or the universe is set in motion, then you don't need God, because you want to rule out any possibility of miracles or supernatural interpretations. Because their worldview was basically everything that happens can be understood through mechanical and physical explanations. They didn't want any possibility of anything that was a supernatural cause or explanation. Okay, that's what they were trying to avoid. So you have typically this is understood as the intelligent designer or the clockmaker. Okay, the clockwork universe. God is the clockmaker. He sets all the gears in place very, very precisely, and he winds it up. And then once he sets it in motion, he's content. Okay, and therefore God is a kind of a spectator. He's on the sidelines. He does not intervene. God is kind of passive in that sense. That's the difference with deism. So one question that you can ask is, well, why would you pray? Why would you pray in a theistic conception? And why would you pray in a deistic conception? In a theistic conception, you may actually pray because you may want or you believe in the prospect of divine intervention and miracles. You may pray because a loved one is sick and you hope that God will answer your prayers and a miraculous event will happen, which is extremely improbable or whatever it may be, or seemingly impossible. And then you say, okay, God answered my prayers. So you believe in the power of prayer as being in some sense a communication with God, and that God may actually answer your prayers. You also pray, if you're a theist, for communion. You want to sort of establish a communion with God. As a deist, why would you pray? You don't pray to God in the aspiration that he's going to answer your prayers or he's going to perform miracles. You don't believe in miracles. But you might nonetheless pray to God out of a sense of communion, out of a sense of a sort of establishing or a relationship or being mindfulness of God. All right. That there's still basically an underlying mystery to existence as to how existence came about, why the Big Bang even happened, and so on. But God does not involve himself in the world. Okay. Again, if you have any questions or comments, just jump right in and cut me off. Okay, now let's describe pantheism and panentheism a little bit more. All right, let me see what time I got here. 11 o'clock, 11:47. Panentheism is the belief that the universe or nature, as the totality of everything, is identical with divinity, or that everything composes an all-encompassing immanent God. That basically we all grow out of this universe, which itself is divine or conscious or aware. Okay, so that's what we get with Spinoza. Spinoza says nature and God are one and the same. The universe and God are the same. God is the universe. There's two ways of understanding that. That literally this universe is a kind of a real growing organism that evolves, and it gradually creates organisms that have eyes and minds that become aware, and that is ultimately the universe as this organism sort of waking up and becoming aware of itself. I'll give you a kind of a more detailed rundown of that. Another way of understanding it is that maybe this is all kind of God's dream, and we are all dream characters, and this is all the dream content of this dream. So what is kind of the substrate, or what is the foundation of this, is that this is all aspects of a singular dream, and we are all partaking in it. Okay, this is what, when people speak of sort of one, we are all one. Okay, this is the oneness of existence. This is what I believe they're trying to articulate. What else did I want to say here? So let's consider that. Okay, this is also what Alan Watts says. He says, if you consider the idea of evolution of the universe, starting with the Big Bang and leading to the present day and age that we find ourselves in, we often have the idea as human beings that we are here and the world is somehow separate from us. We are distinct from the world, and that therefore when we do science, we have this sort of distinct objective perspective on the world, and we're understanding it for ourselves. Okay, but Alan Watts reminds us that we grow out of this world. We are a continuity of that process. So it all starts, let's say you assume Big Bang, a bunch of energy is spewed out, it kind of coagulates, it forms heavier clusters that form kind of stars that make even heavier elements that then enable proteins and amino acids to come together in a more and more sophisticated way on the surface of some specific planets that have the right kind of Goldilocks effect. They're not too hot and they're not too cold, and so these proteins can start to kind of develop and start self-replicating and so on. And then you start to get single cell organisms, and then you get to plants and animals, and then human beings. Okay, so what Alan Watts basically says is we are not something independent of that process, as though we're looking at this whole process from something that comes from outside of it. We occur as a result of it. We grow out of this world, we grow out of this universe. Where else can we come from, in a way? So he says we think of something like the Big Bang happened, but we sort of forget that the Big Bang happened and we are actually a continuation of that same process. So it's sort of like when we become aware and we become curious, that is the universe itself that has evolved to the point that it has evolved organisms like us that are self-aware and that are curious. And then when we start to do modern science and we look out through a telescope and we're trying to understand the night sky and cosmology and astronomy and so on, that is basically the universe now through us and through our eyes and through our minds looking out onto itself and coming to understand itself. So when I look at you and you look at me, it's fundamentally the same existence. It's that same universe, call it God, that is now looking at and interacting with itself. Okay, but you sort of forget that perspective, and then we relapse back into the sort of reptilian brain, which was essential for our evolution, that I have to survive and I am different from you and you're different from me, and I better get one up on you before you get one up on me, and so on. And you can potentially lose track of the fact that we're all in the same boat. We're all of the same stuff. We're all made out of the same Play-Doh. Okay, it's a little bit easier for human beings or for animals because we are, if you view us at any given time and place, we are distinct beings. I am not physically connected to the rest of the world in the way that, let's say, my maple tree in the backyard is literally rooted to the world. I am detached, so therefore I consider myself as independent of it. But in some sense, we are rooted to the world. Okay, I don't know if this is true or not, but you may have heard this idea that basically every cell in your body is regenerated after 7 years. So even while you and your identity remain the same, there's not a single material element in you that is the same over a long enough period of time. You are also a kind of a vortex, a whirlpool that is in continuity with this ever continuing, ever blossoming out creation. Yeah, pantheism. Interesting. Okay, if you guys, maybe some of you guys are familiar with it. If you guys are not familiar with it, then maybe it's interesting or insightful. Let's proceed here. So this is what you get. You get this in Hinduism as well. This whole universe is Brahman, from Brahman to a clod of earth. In other words, it's all the same. Okay, it's all fundamentally that one singular entity, which you might call God or Brahman or the universe. That we're all ultimately that one and the same thing. And in Taoism, heaven and I were created together, and all things and I are one. Okay, there is nowhere where it is not. There's not a single thing without Tao, this sort of cosmic animating force of vitality. So pantheism. And this is also what we get, as I said, in some cases in mystical schools of even monotheistic religions, such as Sufism. Okay, God sleeps in the rock, stirs in the plant, dreams in the plant, stirs in the animal, and ultimately awakens in man. So as I said, when we become awake and we start doing science, that is in some sense, you can understand that as the world itself or the universe itself evolving to the point where it's now becoming self-aware of itself through us. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Pantheism. This one I don't want you to retain, but let me give it to you nonetheless. And let me try to give it to you with this analogy, the analogy of the planet Earth. Okay, and we can talk of Mother Earth. Okay, Mother Earth, we can understand it as, I believe most of us interpret, when we say Mother Earth, you interpret that as figurative. You don't interpret that as literal. Okay, so let me give you 3 conceptions of sort of Mother Earth. One conception is, I would bet, the conception that most of us have of the planet, which is, when we talk about Mother Earth, it's just kind of poetic, it's figurative, it's not to be understood literally. That Mother Earth is not an organism. Mother Earth, this is a kind of the atheistic conception of Mother Earth. The atheistic conception of Mother Earth is the planet is just a rock. Okay, it is not an entity, it is not alive, it is not an organism in and of itself. It is just a thing where other life forms happen to occur on it, okay, or grow out of it. That would be the sort of atheistic conception of Mother Earth. Now you can have the pantheistic conception of Mother Earth, where this is what we call the Gaia hypothesis, that Mother Earth is an organism. Okay, it is an organism with homeostasis and a kind of a metabolism, and it has a kind of a self-correcting homeostasis. It keeps harmony, it keeps balance, and so you would say there's two ways of understanding. Then you, well, would you give, let's say, would you attribute a sort of consciousness or a brain or an intelligence to this Gaia hypothesis? Maybe, maybe not. But you might say, as this kind of pantheistic entity, it might have some will, it has some agency. In other words, it has the capacity to modify itself and its environment. In the same way that, like, when you get a fever, when you get a an infection of something, you might have a fever. That's your, or you might throw up something. It's your way of your body's way of kind of purging or flushing out the intruder. Some people hypothesize that about Mother Nature or the planet, that the planet says, look, I have this organism on me, which is called human beings, and they don't seem to be living in harmony here. They seem to be not understanding the point of what's going on. So I'm going to try to flush them out. I'm going to flush them out with, tsunamis and with climate change and with ever increasing pandemics, because either they're going to get in check and they're going to figure out that they need to be in harmony, just in the same way that your gut bacteria needs to be in harmony with you. Human beings need to be in harmony with the planet. That's one way of understanding the agency of this pantheistic idea of Mother Earth. Another way of understanding the agency is that we ourselves are the agents of Mother Earth, that people that are in line with Mother Earth are then become the sort of the hands and feet, the working hands and feet, exacting the will of this greater entity to which they belong to and they see themselves as belonging to. And then you can have the pandeistic idea of Mother Earth. That would be the kind of the third conception, which is Mother Earth is a kind of an organism, but she is herself helpless. Okay, she has no agency. She has no means by which to change or modify herself or the environment, and therefore she's just kind of she is basically just a kind of a victim of whatever organisms that arise on her, whatever they intend to do. Okay, so kind of the atheistic idea of Mother Earth, which presumably I believe most of us would adhere to, but the other two are also interesting to entertain, at least. Okay, the pantheistic idea of Mother Earth, and then the pandeistic idea of Mother Earth. Okay, proceeding right along. Now this one's probably, I shouldn't say this, my personal preference, but this one's my favorite. Okay, because why not? Why not have the best of both worlds? A God that is immanent and transcendent. So I'll spend a little bit more time on this, and then spend a few minutes on Paul Tillich. So if I haven't said anything that has kind of blown your mind yet, hopefully this will do the trick. Okay, so panentheism is a God which is immanent. The world that we see is the observable aspect of God, and yet there's an aspect of God which is unobservable. Panentheism is a belief system which posits that the divine, whether as a single God, number of gods, or other form of cosmic animating force, interpenetrates every part of the universe and extends timelessly beyond it. Unlike pantheism, which holds that the divine and the universe are identical, panentheism does maintain a distinction between the divine and non-divine, and the significance of both. And one more line that I wanted to read here. God is viewed as the eternal animating force maintaining the universe. Some versions suggest that the universe is nothing but the manifest part of God. So I'll give you some kind of ways to understand that, to try to kind of visualize that. Well, let me give you some kind of silly ones and some good ones. Let's say an onion, the layers of an onion. The layers of the onion are always, you peel off one layer and there's another layer. You peel off another layer and there's another. Those are the immanent layers of the onion. You're always confronted with, a tangible aspect of the onion. And you say, okay, let me keep going down. And even though ultimately you get to the bottom, you get to whatever the germ is, that the onion grows out of, there's nonetheless all of the layers of the immanent, which you can see and you can touch and you can smell, and they do bring tears to your eyes. It points to all of these immanent layers imply something which is mysterious in some sense, or transcendental. It implies in some sense the infinitesimal. Okay. It's kind of like these Mitrushka dolls, these Russian dolls. You might start with, the doll inside the doll inside the doll inside the doll. It's like you start with the doll that is 1 meter tall, and there may be 40 or 50 iterations inside. So you keep taking off the layers, keep taking off the layers. So you start off with a doll 1 meter tall, and by the time you've gone through all the iterations, you're at a doll that's maybe, you know, 5 millimeters tall, which is fascinating. And you know, you reach the end just because the artist was sort of limited. But you can imagine that it maybe could have gone all the way down. All right. So it does imply, all the immanent layers do imply the sort of infinitesimal, which is the transcendent. Let me give you another. Let's say when we talk about real, this world is real. What do we mean by that? Okay, for a philosopher, the idea of reality, for philosophers, realize that that's not a very well-defined term. Or you say this world is material. Okay, it's matter, it's solid, it's rigid, it's real because I can touch it. Okay, don't tell me it's not real because I can touch it. Well, matter or material is something that is kind of convenient and reassuring for non-physicists. But any good physicist knows that even what we mean by material is kind of ambiguous and not very well defined. Because if you go down to the level of the atom is mostly empty space. It's like the distance between the proton and the nearest electron is like the distance between the football on the field and you at the furthest seat in the bleachers in an NFL stadium. Matter is, by our contemporary physical theories, understood to be mostly empty space. Okay. And then furthermore, if you even go into the proton and you start to get into quarks and the subatomic particles and the realm of quantum mechanics and so on, it gets even more tricky, because quantum mechanics, the systems that you're observing are so small that you reach basically the frontier of human of human exploration. It doesn't seem that you can go any deeper. And the reason for that is because the systems that you're trying to observe them, you have to interact with them minimally. That is to say, you have to take some energy out of them, or you have to put some energy into them. There has to be some interaction with those tiny systems. And these systems are so tiny that any observation involves a minimal interaction, which actually alters that which you're observing. So you can never really know, okay? You can never really know what's going on beyond there. That's what's called in quantum mechanics incompatible observables. Okay, if you look at it this way, it's going the other way. If you're looking at it this way, it goes the other way, because the actual act of observing it modifies it. Okay, the minimal amount of interaction that is required, which cannot be cannot be reduced further, inevitably disrupts the system that you're trying to observe. All right. Now let me give you kind of another one. Is if you look at, let's say, the whole history of humanity is itself a kind of a mystery, this kind of generating outward, so it's like, you know, my mother is immanent. I can go, I can talk to her, I can hug her. My grandmother is still alive, okay? But your mother is born of a mother who's 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 born of. You get the point. It's kind of like, it's like this. You can imagine, if you can try to visualize that, okay? It's this birthing forward, and you only ever see the imminent latest layer of that, the latest iteration or generation, but it kind of it goes all the way down. And where does it lead to is that kind of that mystery, that generative mystery of existence. Okay, if some of you are interested in mathematics or computer science, you see this with fractal geometry, like the Mandelbrot set. Okay, like fractals is what is these, you know, very simple geometric shapes that are self-similar and they repeat. Okay, so it's like triangles. You can stack a bunch of triangles onto each other, and in the triangle you can stack more and more triangles, and you can keep adding triangles. Okay, so you're always faced with an immanent layer, which is the triangle that you actually see and that you actually observe. But you can, with a computer program, you can zoom in all the way, and it never ends. Okay, and then you get the Mandelbrot set, which is always different. Okay, so that's kind of special. So now let me throw one more curveball at you, and then we'll talk about Paul Tillich for about 5 minutes. If we take the idea, as we said, in monotheistic religions, we typically have this idea that the world is real. God made this world; it's real. Adam was made out of clay. There's a reality. There's a materiality there. There's a tangibleness. Okay. in many Eastern religions, we have instead of realism, we have idealism, which is to say this world is an illusion or it's a dream. Okay, what is called, it's like a Maya. It's that we don't even know what we mean by real. That this world might be a dream. So now let's go even deeper here. Let's take the idea that the world is a dream and combine it with panentheism. And what does it look like? Okay, it looks like this in Hinduism. That basically this whole unit, what we call reality, is basically just the dream of Brahman. That is the Lord of the universe is dreaming, and he's dreaming all of this up. So all of existence is basically just the dream of this cosmic consciousness, and we are all dream characters in that dream. So in some sense, we are all Brahman. We are all the mind of Brahman insofar as he is dreaming. We are all dream characters in that dream. So we are all Brahman interacting with ourselves, having forgotten that we are the dreamer that is dreaming. And we are all sort of caught up in the drama of life. In just the same way that when you dream, there is the transcendent aspect of you, which is you, the dreamer. That is, in other words, you literally sleeping comfortably in your bed on your pillow with your eyes closed, unaware that you are in your bed. When you are in your dream, you are unaware of the transcendent aspect of the dream, which is you in the bed. Okay, you are fully absorbed in the dream, and insofar as you are in the dream, it appears to you to be fully convincing insofar as it's a reality. And just as you are in a dream, all of the characters that you encounter in your dream, what else can they be other than aspects of your own psyche projected back onto yourself? You're interacting with other creations of your own mind, which is simultaneously creating for yourself a sense of yourself. That is to say, you have a dream body and so on. So you can get murdered in your dream, and that is ultimately your own mind in some sense playing a trick on itself. Okay, but it feels very scary and very serious. So what am I asking you to do? I'm asking you to take that idea of this world as a dream, just as when you actually are dreaming and you're fully absorbed in it, and just take it one layer up. So what we call waking life and what we call reality, now just assume that it is a thicker dream in the mind of Brahman, and we are all dream characters in the mind of Brahman. Okay, so there's a few things to unpack here. You, insofar as you are dreaming, unless you're having a lucid dream, you are unaware that your true nature is the dreamer that is having the dream, and you identify yourself with the immanent form of the dream character and your dream body and your dream hands and so on. So let's what would that look like in what we call reality? Is that we are all Brahman, playing, wearing all of these different masks and interacting with itself subjectively. So it's kind of like like a theater where Brahman is wearing each of these masks. So let's suppose when you were born, at the moment you were born, a mask was put on you, and for the rest of your life, you didn't feel the mask on your face, but everybody always identified you and interacted with you based on the mask that you were given at your birth. Okay. In some sense, that's the case. That is your ego. It's your sense of self. And then what you end up doing is you only end up identifying with that mask that has been given you. And you don't see, in some sense, the truer reality. And so you assume that I am just this ego, and my name is Mike Tillich, and I'm real, and I have to watch out because if I die, then that's it for me. And that kind of gives me anxiety. And I don't know what you're thinking, so I have to get one up on you. Otherwise, you're going to get one up on me. So I better get one up on you first. And it's kind of like, so then you say, well, what's the point? What's the point of this mythology here? The point of this story is you have to sort of attain moksha, is you have to realize that you are the dreamer that is dreaming. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you wake up, but it means that you go on playing the drama, just knowing that it's a drama, and you don't take it so seriously. It's like the old comedian there, Bill Hicks, says. He says, we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There's no such thing as death. Life is only a dream, and we are the imagination of ourselves. Okay, we are all characters in the dream of Brahman, having forgotten that we are Brahman experiencing itself through all these different vantage points. So like, let me give an analogy would be like you have a sphere, and inside the sphere is the inner reality, the immanent world. Okay. And I can drill a bunch of holes in this ball. Okay. And I can shine a light now. There's only one light that I'm shining. And this light now is going to refract and enter into all of these apertures, and it's going to interact with itself. The light is going to interact with itself in the inner sphere. Okay. And even though it's coming from different vantage points, it's ultimately that same light, in the same way that we are all the same consciousness of Brahman, but we identify with the ego. And then we get scared and so on. Now, a student in the other class asked me, well, what happens when Brahman wakes up? And I have no idea. What happens to you when you wake up from a dream? When I wake up from a dream, sometimes I just turn my head to go to the cool side of the pillow. And as I'm just turning momentarily for a fraction of a second, I think, man, I'm having a crazy dream right now. And as soon as my head hits the cool side of the pillow, I'm right back in the dream in many cases, without missing a beat. Either that or a new dream starts. So if Brahman wakes up, then he realizes that there is nothing at all. So he goes back to sleep, and then maybe a new universe starts. It starts all over again, okay? Or maybe it's the eternal reoccurrence, who knows? Okay, any questions or comments with regards to that? So this is a quote here. Let me, if you guys have any questions, let me finish with Paul Tillich, and then if you guys have any questions, you guys speak up. So this is a quote in Hinduism. By me, all this universe pervades my unmanifested forms. All beings abide in me, but I do not abide in them. Okay. So what's Paul Tillich going to say? Let me try to go through this in the next 4 or 5 minutes. Paul Tillich is going to say, philosophy gives rise to the questions, specifically the existential questions of, our life and the meaning of our life and what we're supposed to do with it. And he says, then theology, the primary role of theology is to answer those questions, is to give us a meaningful answers, not to, salvation or the meaning of life generally, but to our concerns about being alive insofar as we are specific subjective individuals. All right. And this is what he's going to say about God. It's very interesting what he says about God. It's almost pantheistic, but like you're not supposed to say it, he says God is basically existence itself. God is what he calls the ground of being. It's the foundation upon which everything is built upon and everything takes place. It is the absolute background upon which everything rests. And because it's the fundamental background upon which everything rests, it is, because it's always there, you don't see it at all. Okay, because it's always there, it has no quality or property or condition. It has no attribute to it. Okay, so this is what he says: God is being itself. God does not exist. It's kind of paradoxical what he says here. God does not exist because God is beyond essence and existence. God is in some sense the foundation of the possibility of having an existence at all. Okay, God is the fundamental background upon which everything is painted. All right. He says, therefore, to argue that God exists is to deny him. That's very interesting. So anybody who is sure that they know what God is and talks about God with that confidence, Paul Tillich says he has missed the point. Okay, God is not a being because God is being itself. Beings are things that are in the world. Okay, God is not in the world. God is the basis of the world. Okay, so beings are things in space and time with qualities and attributes. God is it's like the canvas. It's a canvas upon which this whole existence is painted. He says it is as atheistic to affirm the existence of God as it is to deny it. God is being itself, not a being. So what does he go? He goes on to say, the being of God is being itself. The being of God cannot be understood as the existence of a being alongside or above other beings. Okay. God is being itself, is the most foundation and fundamental thing that even to try to talk about it is to try to qualify it in some way. And in qualifying it, you've already said too much. So that goes back to our opening point, which is in some cases, you're better off if you truly understand God, you realize that the correct thing to do is to not talk about it at all. Okay, it's kind of like a feeling. It's kind of like a background feeling. So he says God does not exist because God is in some sense existence itself. Okay, now why is this meaningful from an existential point of view? I'll try to do this in about 2 minutes. He says our individuality, our subjective experience is integral. It's fundamental to our life. And he says we have to get rid of this idea of the old God as, you know, this all-seeing figure with a thick white beard up on the clouds that is observing everything, even our innermost thoughts and our feelings and our worries and our concerns and our anxieties. He says it deprives us of our subjectivity. It's kind of like, you know, like 1984, Big Brother. Big Brother knows everything that you, everybody that you're talking to, everywhere that you've gone, all the books that you've bought. It's like God is like Big Brother in 1984, but on steroids. In that not only does he know everything about you, but he also knows what you're thinking, what you're fearing, what you desire. You know, so he says it deprives me of my own subjectivity. It takes my subjectivity and it turns it into an object of scrutiny. There is no inner private individual life because it becomes a matter of scrutiny and judgment of this higher sort of tyrannical figure. So he says we have to get beyond that idea of this old theistic idea of God as God the Father, because he says it's a tyrannical figure. He says this is the figure that Nietzsche is revolting against when Nietzsche says God is dead, because it's unbearable. It's you don't even have the most important thing for yourself, which is your own private subjective experience in this life. It itself becomes an object of judgment and scrutiny. Okay, so that's it. Okay, keep that idea of God is the foundation of existence in a way, but even that's saying too much, and that God deprives us, at least the old God deprives us of our subjectivity. Okay, let's conclude there. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we stop here? Any questions, comments, reactions to any of that?